The silence of a Richmond Sunday morning was a holy thing, thick and heavy as the damask curtains in Elias Croft's study. It was a silence woven from piety and expectation, from the scent of beeswax on polished mahogany and the distant sonorous peal of the St. John's Church bell calling the righteous to worship. Outside, the August air hung like a wet shroud over the city, promising a day of blistering heat. But inside the brick townhouse on Grace Street, all was cool, ordered, and still. It was a stillness Elias Croft cultivated, as he did his tobacco fields and his public reputation, with a firm, unyielding hand. On this particular Sunday, the 10th of August, 1852, the stillness was perfect. Croft knelt on a velvet-covered hassock, his back ramrod straight, his silver-white hair catching the morning light that filtered through the tall, mullioned windows. His Bible, a formidable tome bound in Moroccan leather, lay open on the desk before him to the book of Job. He was a man who appreciated the trials of the righteous, seeing his own prosperity as a testament to a faith that had been tested and found pure. His lips moved, but the words were a whisper, a private covenant between himself and a God who, Croft was certain, looked upon him with singular favor. Behind him, Daniel stood. He was a fixture in the room, as much a part of its decor as the terrestrial globe in the corner, or the stern portrait of Croft's father above the mantel. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that could mend a broken carriage wheel or carve a delicate finial for a four-poster bed with equal skill. He had been born on a Croft plantation, his lineage a property line in a ledger book. For 30 years he had been known simply as Daniel, a name stripped of any surname, any history, beyond that which his master owned. To the society of Richmond, he was Croft's Daniel, a trusted house slave, known for his quiet efficiency and his unnervingly intelligent eyes. Those eyes, the color of dark, wet earth, were fixed now on the back of his master's neck. The house held its breath. In the kitchen below, the cook, Sarah, was sliding a pan of beaten biscuits into the oven, the metallic scrape a fleeting, jarring note in the symphony of silence. In the parlor, Eleanor Croft, a woman whose beauty had faded into a kind of brittle fragility, adjusted her lace shawl, her thoughts on the sermon and the inevitable gossip that would follow. The world was turning on its usual axis, lubricated by ritual and routine. Daniel's hand, steady and sure, moved to the sash around his waist. His fingers found the familiar handle, its polished bone smooth and cool against his skin. It was his master's own grooming razor, the one Daniel was tasked with stropping to a fearsome edge each morning. It was a beautiful object, its steel blade inlaid with a delicate scrollwork of gold. A gentleman's tool. A tool for imposing order on the wildness of nature, for scraping away the daily growth of beard, for maintaining a civilized facade. Elias Croft murmured a passage, his voice a low hum. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." The air in the room seemed to thin, to grow sharp. The scent of beeswax was suddenly cloying, mingling with the faint, metallic smell of the blade as Daniel brought it into the light. The razor was an extension of his own hand, a cold, focused point of intention in the quiet room. He saw the vulnerable crease of skin above the stiff, starched collar. He saw the way the silver hairs curled at the nape of the neck. He saw 30 years of unheard pleas, of swallowed rage, of measured obedience. He saw the auction block where his mother had been sold south. He saw the face of Alara, her eyes wide with terror as she was loaded onto a wagon bound for a Louisiana sugar plantation, her name a ghost on his lips. He saw every casual cruelty, every pious justification, every moment of ownership that had scraped away at his soul until only a hard, dense core of purpose remained. He took one silent step forward. The floorboard did not creak. He was a shadow, detaching itself from the wall. The St. John's bell tolled again, a deep, resonant dong that vibrated in the glass of the window panes. It was a call to prayer, a summons. Elias Croft never heard the whisper of steel. He never felt the hand that cupped his chin, tilting his head back with a motion that was almost tender. His final prayer was cut short, replaced by a wet, guttural sound, a question mark of disbelief, turning into a period of blood. The razor moved with the swift, economic grace of a master craftsman. One clean, deep motion. For a long moment, the only sound was a liquid whisper, a dark red blossoming on the white linen of Croft's collar. The blood soaked into the velvet of the hassock, pooling on the polished heart pine floor. Daniel stood over the body, his breath coming in a single, shuddering exhalation. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel rage. He felt a profound and terrifying emptiness, the kind of silence that comes after a great bell has ceased its ringing. He looked at the open Bible. A splash of red had landed on the page, obscuring the name of Job. He laid the razor, now crimson-tipped, gently on the desk beside the holy book. He did not run. He did not hide. He walked to the window and looked out at the sun-drenched street, at the carriages beginning to roll toward the church. He listened to the bell, its call echoing in the sudden, vast silence of the house. The world outside was still ordered, still pious, still turning. But inside, in the cool, book-lined study of Elias Croft, a different kind of sermon had just been delivered, and its amen was the spreading pool of blood on the floor. Constable Thaddeus Reed was a man who preferred the simple, brutal logic of a tavern brawl to the mannered hypocrisy of Richmond's elite. He was stout, with a weathered face and hands that seemed more suited to a blacksmith's forge than a lawman's ledger. He had a bloodhound's nose for falsehood, a scent that hung heavy in the parlors and drawing rooms of the city's wealthy. When the summons came, a panicked, screaming housemaid spilling onto the steps of the constabulary, he knew this was not a matter of stolen silver or a drunken duel. The terror in the girl's eyes was primal. He arrived at the Croft house to find a scene of curated chaos. Eleanora Croft had fainted into the arms of her personal maid, a tableau of tragic womanhood performed for the benefit of the neighbors who now gathered on the sidewalk, their Sunday finery a stark contrast to the grim whispers that passed between them. Reed ignored them, his boots loud on the polished floors as he was led upstairs by a trembling butler whose face was the color of old parchment. The study smelled of copper and terror. The body of Elias Croft was still kneeling, slumped forward against the desk, as if in a final, desperate prayer. The tableau was so grotesque, so blasphemous in its setting, that it took Reed a moment to process the details: the deep, gaping wound in the throat, the razor resting beside the Bible like a sacrificial knife, the blood, so much blood, already beginning to congeal and blacken on the floor. Who found him? Reed's voice was a low growl, cutting through the stunned silence. His wife, sir, the butler stammered. Mrs. Croft? She came to call him for church. The bell, it had rung its final call. Reed knelt, careful not to disturb the scene. He looked at the weapon. It was a high-quality instrument, clean but for the blood. This was not the work of a common thief. A thief would have been clumsy, frantic. A thief would have taken the silver candlesticks from the mantel. This was something else. This was personal. Where is everyone? Reed asked, his eyes scanning the room. The staff? In the kitchen, sir. I gathered them there, all accounted for. All of them? The butler hesitated. A flicker of something, fear, or perhaps a desperate attempt at loyalty, crossed his face. All but one, sir. Daniel. He is not here. Croft's Daniel. Reed knew the man by reputation, a model slave. Quiet, skilled, trustworthy. The kind of man Elias Croft would point to as proof of the system's benevolence. Where is he? We do not know, sir. His room is empty. His bed has not been slept in. The answer was too simple, too neat. In Reed's experience, nothing was ever that simple. He walked over to the window. From here, he could see the rooftops of Shockoe Bottom, the valley where the city's slave auction houses and jails were clustered. It was a place of immense human misery, a wound in the city's heart that the gentry on Gray Street preferred to ignore. A man could disappear into the bottom, or he could flee north, toward the promise of the abolitionist states. Reed's gaze fell upon a small object on the windowsill, almost hidden behind a potted fern. He picked it up. It was a bird, no bigger than his thumb, carved from a scrap of dark walnut. Its head was cocked, its beak open as if in song. The detail was exquisite, the work of a patient and gifted hand. He had seen work like this before, on a custom-made cabinet in the governor's mansion. The work of Croft's Daniel. Reed slipped the wooden bird into his pocket. It felt warm, almost alive. He spent the next hour overseeing the grim necessities of his trade. He had the body removed, his men grunting under the weight, their boots smearing the bloody patterns on the floor. He interviewed a hysterical Eleanora Croft, who could only sob about her husband's goodness and the ingratitude of savages. Her grief felt real, but it was layered with a brittle, theatrical quality, as if she were playing a role she had long rehearsed. Then he went down to the kitchens. The air was thick, with the smell of yeast, sweat, and fear. The house slaves were huddled together, their faces a gallery of masks. Sarah, the cook, a large woman with weary eyes, stood with her arms crossed, a bastion of stoicism. Samuel, the ancient gardener, sat on a stool, his head bowed, his gnarled hands clasped around a walking stick. A few younger maids wept silently. "I need to know about Daniel," Reed said, his voice softer now. He knew that direct questions would yield nothing but downcast eyes and shrugged shoulders. "When was the last time you saw him?" Silence. The only sound was the ticking of a tall case clock in the hall. "He was a quiet man," Reed prompted, watching their faces. "Did he seem troubled?" Sarah looked up, her gaze meeting his for a brief, challenging moment. "The master worked him hard, sir. Daniel had gifted hands. The master didn't like to see gifted hands be idle." "Did he and the master argue?" A flicker of a bitter smile touched Sarah's lips. "We don't argue, Constable. We listen." Reed felt the familiar wall of silence rising, a defense built of generations of shared suffering and mistrust. They would not give him Daniel. To them, the law was not a protector. It was just another instrument of the master's. He knew he would have to find the truth another way. He went to Daniel's room, a small, clean space in the attic, suffocatingly hot under the eaves. It was monastic in its simplicity. A narrow bed, neatly made. A small chest for his clothes. A workbench by the single window. Scraps of wood and carving tools were laid out with meticulous care. There were no personal effects, no letters, no trinkets. It was the room of a man who owned nothing, not even his own life. But on the wall, tucked beside the window frame, was a small, smudged charcoal drawing on a piece of scrap paper. It was a woman's face. She was young, with large, sorrowful eyes and hair braided with what looked like wildflowers. It was rendered with the same delicate skill as the carved bird. Below it, a single name was written in a careful, elegant script. A. Laura. The name meant nothing to Reed, but it was a thread, and in the silent, oppressive heat of the attic room, with the ghost of a name on the wall, Thaddeus Reed felt the first tremor of understanding. This was not a simple case of a slave running amok. This was an execution, and an execution required a judge, a jury, and a sentence. The constable's job was to find the killer. But a colder, deeper question began to form in his mind. Who, in this house of God-fearing silence, had been the true sinner? The city of Richmond thrummed with a nervous energy in the days that followed. The murder of Elias Croft was a tear in the social fabric, a terrifying anomaly that threatened the carefully constructed peace between master and slave. It was one thing for a field hand, brutalized by the sun and the lash, to snap. But for a trusted house slave, a man treated with what the Richmond papers called every Christian kindness, to commit such a barbaric act was unthinkable. It suggested a rot not at the fringes of their society, but at its very heart. Slave patrols were doubled, curfews were strictly enforced. Any black man, free or enslaved, found on the streets after dark, was subject to immediate arrest and questioning, which often involved the persuasive power of a leather strap. The fear was palpable, a foul miasma rising from the cobbled streets. The white citizen saw a potential killer in every shadow, a conspirator in every downcast eye. The black community, in turn, retreated into a deeper silence, a shared understanding that the wrath of one man could bring collective punishment upon them all. Constable Reed felt the pressure from all sides. The mayor wanted an arrest. The wealthy merchants, Croft's friends and colleagues, demanded swift justice, a public hanging that would serve as a stark warning. They spoke of Daniel as if he were a rabid dog to be put down, a monster devoid of reason or soul. But Reed, with the small wooden bird in his pocket and the ghost name Elara in his mind, could not shake the feeling that the monster was not the man he was hunting, but the story everyone had already agreed to believe. His investigation became a slow, frustrating excavation of secrets. He started in Shockoe Bottom. The name itself was a blight, a geographical basin where the city's ugliest commerce was conducted. The air there was different, thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, cheap liquor, and despair. Reed hated the Bottom. It was a place where human beings were catalogued and sold like livestock, their value assessed by the quality of their teeth and the strength of their backs. He found his way to Robert Lumpkin's slave jail, a notorious holding pen known as the Devil's Half-Acre. Lumpkin was a man who had grown rich on human misery, a portly, sweat-stained creature with eyes like polished stones. He greeted Reed with a greasy smile, offering him a glass of bourbon. "A terrible business, Constable," Lumpkin said, shaking his head. "Elias Croft, a pillar of our community. To be cut down by one of his own, it shakes a man's faith." "I'm looking for information, Lumpkin," Reed said, ignoring the drink. "About a woman, a Beluche slave named Elara. Croft may have sold her." Lumpkin's smile tightened. He ran a thumb over the pages of a massive leather-bound ledger on his desk. The book contained the names, ages, and sale prices of thousands of souls. Elara. The name is common enough. Do you have a surname?" "She wouldn't have one," Reed said flatly. "She belonged to Croft." "Ah. Well, Elias did business with me from time to time. A shrewd man, always got top dollar. Let's see." He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing the neat columns of ink. "Here we are. 2 years ago. A girl named Elara, 21 years of age. Sold to a Mr. Dubois, a sugar man from Louisiana. Prime field hand, strong breeder. Fetched a good price, $1,800. Why was she sold?" Lumpkin shrugged, a theatrical gesture of indifference. "Croft said she'd grown. Troublesome. A bit of a dreamer, he called her. Filling the other slaves' heads with foolish ideas. Bad for morale. Sometimes you have to cull the herd, Constable. It's just business." "And Daniel?" Reed asked. "Did he know this, Elara?" Lumpkin chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Know her. Constable, they were practically joined at the hip. Grew up together. On the plantation out in Henrico County. Croft brought them both into the city when he moved into the Gray Street house. Daniel. He was the quiet one, the craftsman. She was the fire. He'd follow her around like a shadow, used to carve her little things, birds, flowers, silly trinkets. Reed's hand went to his pocket, his fingers closing around the wooden mockingbird. So he would have been upset when she was sold. Upset? Lumpkin let out a laugh. The boy went half mad. Croft had to have him chained in the smokehouse for a week to break his spirit. When he came out, he was different, quieter, colder. All that skill in his hands, it was still there, but the light in his eyes was gone. Elias thought he'd broken him, made him a perfect, obedient tool. Looks like the tool had a sharper edge than he imagined. Reed left the stench of Shockoe Bottom behind, but the ugliness of Lumpkin's story clung to him. He could picture it. Daniel, locked in the darkness of the smokehouse, the smell of cured meat in the air, listening to the sounds of the city, knowing Alara was gone forever. A week in the dark. A lifetime of cold fury. He returned to the Croft house that afternoon. Eleonora was receiving guests in the parlor, a flock of black-clad women who cooed at her with practiced sympathy. Reed bypassed them and found Sarah in the kitchen, kneading a great mound of dough on a floured countertop. He placed the carved bird on the table beside her. Sarah's hands stilled. She stared at the small object for a long moment, her face unreadable. "He made this for Alara," Reed said. It wasn't a question. Sarah did not look at him. She resumed her kneading, her movements slow and deliberate. Daniel had a way with wood. He could make it sing. "Tell me about her, Sarah." "There's nothing to tell. She's gone. She was sold." The dough thumped against the wooden board. Thump! Thump! Mr. Croft needed the money. He had debts. This was new. Elias Croft, the pillar of the community, had debts? What kind of debts? "The kind a gentleman don't speak of," Sarah said, her voice low. "Cards. Bad investments. He kept a fine house, a fine carriage, fine clothes. Finery costs money. Sometimes it costs more than money." Her eyes, dark and knowing, finally met his. In them, Reed saw a story far more complex than a simple tale of business. "Did Mrs. Croft know about Alara and Daniel?" Sarah gave a short, harsh laugh. "Mrs. Croft knows what she chooses to know. She saw a pretty girl who was too familiar with her husband's prized carpenter. She saw a distraction, so she had it removed. She whispered in the master's ear, told him the girl was insolent, that she was a bad influence. She watered the seed of his greed, and it grew. The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a picture of casual domestic cruelty. A love destroyed for convenience, a man broken for profit, a wife's jealousy, and a husband's greed combining to create a tragedy that had festered for 2 years. "He never got over her," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper now. "Every Sunday, when the master was at his prayers, Daniel would stand behind him, and I know he wasn't listening to Mr. Croft's God. He was praying to his own, a God of memory, a God of vengeance." Reed left the kitchen, the warmth of the oven, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He walked through the silent, opulent house, a monument to a man's vanity. He saw it now, not as a home, but as a cage. A beautifully appointed, gracefully furnished cage, where every inhabitant, from the master in his study to the cook in her kitchen, was imprisoned by a system of lies, debts, and unspoken desires. He went back to the study, the scene of the crime. The blood stain on the floor had been scrubbed, but a dark shadow remained, a permanent accusation against the heart pine boards. Reed stood where Daniel must have stood, behind the desk. He looked at the velvet hassock, at the leather-bound Bible. He tried to imagine the silence, the tolling of the church bell, the cold weight of the razor in his hand. He opened the Bible. It was still turned to the book of Job. Reed was not a religious man, but he knew the story. a good man tormented by God to test his faith. Elias Croft had seen himself as Job, righteous in his suffering, his wealth a reward for his piety. But what if Daniel had seen it differently? What if he had seen Croft not as Job, but as the affliction, as the senseless, cruel force that took everything a man held dear for no reason other than because he could? Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. The words echoed in Reed's mind. It was a statement of faith. But whose? The master, praying to his God of prosperity, or the slave, making a final, bloody covenant with his own God of justice? The manhunt for Daniel intensified. Posters bearing a crude likeness and a promise of a $500 reward were nailed to courthouse doors and tavern walls from Richmond to Fredericksburg. He was no longer just Daniel. He was the Sunday morning slasher, a creature of Gothic horror in the popular imagination. Stories circulated of his supposed savagery, of his unnatural strength, of the demonic light in his eyes. He became a cautionary tale whispered to unruly children, a boogeyman for a society terrified of the consequences of its own sins. For Daniel, the world had shrunk to the primal realities of hunger, fear, and flight. He had vanished into the great dismal swamp, a sprawling, menacing wilderness of cypress trees, black water, and tangled undergrowth that straddled the border of Virginia and North Carolina. It was a place of refuge for fugitives, a lawless labyrinth where the slave patrols, dogs, lost the scent, and men could disappear for generations, forming their own hidden communities. The swamp was a living entity, breathing a hot, fetid air that smelled of decay and rebirth. The light was a pale green, filtered through a dense canopy of leaves. The silence was a symphony of unseen things, the hum of a million insects, the guttural croak of a bullfrog, the sudden splash of a water moccasin sliding from a log. To the men who hunted him it was a hellish maze. To Daniel it was a sanctuary. The rules of Grace Street did not apply here. There were no bells to mark his time, no masters to command his hands. There was only survival. His skills as a craftsman served him well. His hands, which had once carved the delicate legs of a lady's writing desk, now fashioned snares to catch rabbits and squirrels. He could read the landscape, find the high dry ground for sleeping, identify the edible roots and berries. He moved through the swamp not like a man, but like an animal, silent and observant, his senses honed to a razor's edge. Days bled into nights. He lost track of time. His past became a series of vivid, tormenting images that came to him in the feverish haze of sleep. He saw Ilara's face, not as it was in the charcoal sketch, but as it had been on the day she was taken. He had stood on the edge of the crowd in Shockoe Bottom, helpless, a ghost in his own life, as Lumpkin, the auctioneer, had described her virtues. A strong back and wide hips for breeding, a docile temperament. Look at those teeth, gentlemen, sound as the dollar you'll pay for her. He remembered the feel of her hand in his the night before, in the small garden behind the Croft house. They had met there in secret, under a sky full of stars that seemed impossibly distant. She had been the one with the fire, the one who whispered of the North, of a place called Canada where they could be free. She had learned to read in secret, taught by a sympathetic coachman who had since been sold. She would read scraps of abolitionist pamphlets to him, her voice a fierce, hopeful whisper. Words like freedom and dignity were not abstractions to her. They were tangible things, promises waiting on a distant shore. "We're not made for this life, Daniel," she had said, her eyes burning in the moonlight. "We're not wood to be carved to their liking. We're people. Our lives are our own." He, the cautious one, the quiet one, had been afraid. He saw the risks, the dogs, the patrols, the terrible punishment for those who were caught. He had his craft, a small island of pride in an ocean of servitude. He could create beautiful things. He thought, foolishly, that this might be enough. "They'll never let us go." "Ilara," he had whispered. "Then we must take ourselves," she had insisted. The next day she was gone. Mrs. Croft had discovered one of the pamphlets. A single whisper to the master was all it took. Alara's fire was deemed a danger to the kindling of the other slaves. She was extinguished, sold south to the cane fields, a fate worse than death. And Daniel learned the bitter lesson that his skill, his obedience, his quiet dignity, none of it mattered. It was all a leash, and his master held the end of it. The beauty he created with his hands only served to adorn the cage. In the swamp, these memories were his only companions. They were a torment, but they were also a fuel. The act in the study had not been an act of passion. It had been a slow, deliberate distillation of 2 years of grief and rage. It had been a ritual. He had not simply killed a man. He had corrected an imbalance in the universe. He had answered Ilara's whispered words. He had taken something back. One evening, as dusk settled, painting the Blackwater in shades of purple and orange, he heard a sound that did not belong in the swamp. It was the faint, mournful baying of a hound. They were coming. He felt no panic, only a grim resignation. He had known they would. The world of men, with its laws and its ledgers, would not allow his act to stand. He climbed a cypress tree, its branches draped with Spanish moss, and watched from the shadows. He saw them an hour later, a party of 5 men, armed with rifles and leading 3 dogs on leashes. They were moving slowly, uncertainly, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and determination. The swamp was disorienting them. They were loud, clumsy, intruders in this ancient, quiet place. He could have fled deeper into the morass, led them on a chase that could last for weeks. But as he watched them, a profound weariness settled over him. He had done the thing he had set out to do. His life, as he had known it, was over. What remained was only the final accounting. He waited. He listened to the mockingbirds that filled the twilight air with their chorus of borrowed songs. He had always loved them. Ilara had said they were like spies learning the secrets of all the other birds. She said they sang the prettiest songs but had no true song of their own. Like us, she had said, we learn their language, their religion, their ways, but our own song is trapped inside. He thought of the small wooden mockingbird he had left on the windowsill in the study, a message for whoever was clever enough to read it. A final, silent song. The hunting party made camp at the base of his tree, their fire a small, defiant bloom of orange against the draped gathering dark. They were confident they had lost his trail, their voices a low murmur of frustration and bravado. Daniel watched them from above, a silent, unseen judge. He could have slipped away in the night, but he did not. He waited for the dawn. When the first pale light of morning filtered through the canopy, he began to sing. It was not a song of words. It was a low, mournful spiritual, a melody that had been born in the tobacco fields, a song of sorrow and longing, and a sliver of hope. It was a sound that was both human and wild, a part of the swamp's own music. The men below froze. They looked up, their rifles raised. They saw him then, a dark silhouette against the brightening sky, perched on a branch like a great, strange bird. "It's him," one of the men whispered, his voice full of awe and terror. Daniel stopped singing. He looked down at them, his face calm, his eyes holding the accumulated weight of his 30 years. He did not climb down. He did not raise his hands in surrender. He simply waited. A rifle shot cracked through the morning stillness. The sound was an obscenity in the sacred quiet. A flock of egrets exploded from the trees, their white wings a frantic, silent scream against the sky. Daniel's body jerked, then slumped. For a moment he clung to the branch, and then he fell, tumbling through the veils of Spanish moss, landing with a soft final thud on the damp earth below. The men approached him cautiously, their rifles still aimed at his still form. The leader of the patrol, a grim-faced planter named Blevins, nudged the body with his boot. "Well," Blevins said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice, "there's your $500. The Sunday morning slasher, not so monstrous up close, is he?" He was right. In death. Daniel looked smaller, younger, just a man, dressed in rags, his hands, the hands that could make wood sing, resting peacefully at his sides. There was no demonic light in his eyes. They were closed. They slung his body over a mule and began the long, triumphant journey back to Richmond. They had their monster. They had their justice. They left the silence of the swamp behind them, but they could not see the way the Spanish moss swayed in the branches where he had fallen, like mourning veils. They could not hear the chorus of the mockingbirds, which seemed to rise in volume as they departed, filling the air with a cacophony of stolen songs, as if trying to piece together the one that had just been silenced. Constable Reed was in his office, staring at the small, carved bird on his desk, when Blevins and his patrol rode into town. The news spread like wildfire. A crowd gathered as Daniel's body was unceremoniously dumped on the steps of the courthouse, a trophy for the city to gaze upon. The people cheered. They saw the end of a threat, the restoration of order. Reed pushed through the throng. He looked down at the body. The face was peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence of his death and the savagery of his alleged crime. Reed felt a profound sense of failure. He had been hunting a man, but the mob had wanted a monster. And now they had one, conveniently dead, unable to speak, unable to complicate their simple story of good and evil. The official report would be simple. Fugitive slave, resisting capture, killed while attempting to escape. Case closed. Justice served. The newspapers would praise the brave men of the patrol. The ministers would preach sermons on the righteous punishment of the wicked. Elias Croft would be memorialized as a martyr, and Daniel would be buried in an unmarked grave, his story reduced to a single, brutal act. Reed went back to his office and locked the door. He sat at his desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper to write his official report. He dipped his pen in the inkwell, but he could not write. He kept seeing the charcoal sketch of Alara's face. He kept hearing the oily chuckle of Robert Lumpkin. He kept feeling the oppressive, hypocritical silence of the Croft house. He thought of the two Bibles, the one in Croft's study, its pages spattered with blood, a testament to a faith that had failed to save him, and the other, invisible Bible, the one Daniel must have carried in his head, a book of judgment, of retribution, of an eye for an eye, a Bible where the righteous were not the masters, but the enslaved, and where salvation was not a promise in the next life, but a reckoning in this one. He looked at the official charge sheet. Knipe Daniel, of the estate of Elias Croft. Charge, murder. Reed picked up his pen. He dipped it in the ink, and with a steady hand, he crossed out the word, Osh, murder. In its place, he wrote a single word. Osh, Hosh, Osh, 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 Osh. Then, with a weary sigh, he crumpled it in his fist. He knew he could never file such a report. The world was not ready for that kind of truth. The system he served was built on the foundation of 1,000, 1,000,000, such untold truths. To expose one would be to threaten the entire edifice. He took out a new sheet of paper. He began to write the simple, official lie. Fugitive slave resisting capture, killed. The words felt like stones in his mouth. As he wrote, he could hear the distant sound of a church bell, calling the faithful to evening prayer. The sound had never seemed so hollow, so meaningless. The small wooden mockingbird sat on his desk, its beak open, its silent song a witness to the entire sorry affair. The legend of Daniel, began not in the grand houses of Gray Street, but in the hushed conversations of the slave quarters, in the quiet spaces where the master's ear could not reach. The official story was that he had been shot and killed in the dismal swamp, his body brought back as a warning. But another story, a better story, began to grow in the fertile soil of hope and defiance. Some said the body brought back to Richmond was not his, but that of another runaway, a convenient substitute to satisfy the city's lust for vengeance. They said Daniel had become a part of the swamp, a spirit of the Blackwater who could command the snakes and the gators, a phantom who helped other runaways find their way north along the secret railroad that wound through the morass. They called him the Swamp Ghost. Others whispered that he had never sung that morning. They said that when the patrol found him, he had looked at them with eyes that burned with cold fire, and he had simply vanished into the morning mist. The patrol, too ashamed to admit they had been outwitted by one man, had shot a stranger and claimed the bounty. The most poetic version of the tale, the one that endured the longest, was that the mockingbirds of the swamp had lifted him from the branch and carried him away, his body becoming light as air, his spirit joining their chorus. They said that on still nights, if you listened closely, you could hear a new song among the others, a low, mournful spiritual that no other bird knew how to sing. It was the song of a man who had refused to be a tool, who had chosen to be a weapon, and who, in the end, had become a ghost, a melody, a warning. The Croft house on Gray Street became a place of whispers as well. Eleanor Croft, unable to bear the memories, sold it within the year and moved to Charleston to live with her sister. The new family, the Archers, complained of a peculiar chill in the study, even on the hottest summer days. Their maids swore they could sometimes smell the faint, coppery scent of old blood that no amount of scrubbing could remove. They said that on Sunday mornings, when the St. John's bell rang for service, a single wooden mockingbird, perched on the windowsill, would begin to tremble, as if trying to break into song. The house passed through several more hands over the next decade, its reputation growing darker with each telling. It became a place that children dared each other to approach after dark, a monument to a crime that the city was desperate to forget, but which the house itself seemed determined to remember. Thaddeus Reed served as constable for 5 more years before retiring. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, a man haunted by a truth he could never speak aloud. He kept the small, carved mockingbird on his mantelpiece, a constant, silent companion. He never spoke of the Croft case, but sometimes, late at night, his wife would find him sitting by the fire, turning the small wooden bird over and over in his hands, his face a mask of sorrow and contemplation. He had been a keeper of the law, but he had come to understand that the law and justice were often two entirely different things. He had upheld the one, and in doing so, had been forced to betray the other. When the cannons first fired on Fort Sumter in 1861, igniting the great, bloody conflagration of the Civil War, Reed was an old man. He watched as Richmond, the proud capital of the Confederacy, became a city of hospitals and barracks, its streets filled with the sound of marching feet and the grim sight of wounded men. He saw the sons of the city's finest families, the heirs of men like Elias Croft, march off to fight for a way of life that was already rotting from the inside out. He lived long enough to see the end, to see the city burn in the final, desperate days of the war. He stood on a hill and watched the flames consume the rooftops of Shockoe Bottom, the auction houses and slave jails turning to ash, a pyre for a century of sin. He saw the columns of Union soldiers, many of them black men in blue uniforms, marching up Gray Street, their faces set with a grim, triumphant purpose. They marched past the blackened, empty shell of the Croft house, its windows like vacant eyes, its grand facade scarred by soot. In that moment, watching the old world burn and the new one being forged in fire, Thaddeus Reed thought of Daniel. He thought of the single, violent act in the quiet study. It had seemed like an anomaly then, a monstrous aberration. But now, in the context of a war that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, It seemed like something else entirely. It was not the start of the storm, but the first tremor, the first crack in the foundation. It was the prologue to a much larger, bloodier sermon. The world had called Daniel a monster, a slasher, a savage. But Reed, in the clarity of his old age, saw him for what he was: a prophet, a man who had seen the hypocrisy and the rot at the heart of his world, and had taken a razor to it. His was not an act of madness, but an act of terrible, terrifying sanity. He had simply delivered the judgment that history, in its own brutal, inexorable way, was now delivering upon the entire South. The old constable died a year after the war ended. His possessions were divided among his children. His son, uninterested in the dusty trinkets on the mantel, tossed the small, carved mockingbird into a box of unwanted things. It was lost to time, its silent story known to no one. But stories, like seeds, have a way of surviving. The story of Croft's Daniel, the house slave who slit his master's throat during Sunday prayer, became a part of Richmond's secret history, a ghost that haunted the city's memory. It was a tale told in different ways, with different endings, but the core of it remained the same: a story of a quiet man who, for one brief, terrible moment, had made the world listen to his song. It was a song of rage and grief, and a desperate, bloody cry for a justice that the heavens would not provide, and so had to be carved, with a razor's edge, into the heart of the earth.